The French Revolution, Part 3. In November of 1799, the people of France felt that the Directory and the two-house legislature under which they were currently living was too oppressive, that despite the original intentions of the Directory, they had become absolutist in nature and very oppressive, hunting down anyone who criticized them and throwing them in jail. So the Directory was not much different than Robespierre and the National Convention in the eyes of many French citizens. Many of them lamented, cried for some sort of relief. Is there no one who can save us from all this chaos? We're exhausted. We've been fighting each other for 10 years over how France is going to develop. We would like to get a good, stable government. We're fighting against Austria, Prussia, Spain, and Great Britain. Can't we get some relief? We need a good, strong, solid kind of man to lead us into the future. And most people felt that they knew who that person could be, and that was a popular, young, dashing military hero who had made one heck of a great name for himself during the international phase of the French Revolution, and that was the young officer Napoleon Bonaparte. People in France began to clamor and beg and plead for Napoleon to rescue them from the Directory. It just so happened that Napoleon's brother served in the two-house legislature, and he conspired with Napoleon to stage what the French call a coup d'etat, or overthrow of the government, in November of 1799. So Napoleon Bonaparte, with some co-conspirators inside the Directory and the two-house legislature, overthrew the Directory and the two-house legislature in November of 1799, and Napoleon became the sole leader of France. He took the title First Consul in 1799, but by 1804, the true colors of Napoleon were clear. Napoleon had as his overriding personality trait ambition. By 1804, Napoleon was not satisfied with the title First Consul. He desired something more grand, and in 1804 he staged an elaborate coronation ceremony for himself and his wife Josephine. In 1804, with popular support, Napoleon, who was supposed to rescue the people from absolutism, proclaimed himself and his wife Emperor and Empress for life of France. But who was Napoleon Bonaparte? Where did he come from? It seems almost that he comes from out of nowhere. You may be wondering, well, where was he all this time? Historians usually describe the rise of Napoleon to fame and fortune as meteoric. Like a meteor in the sky. Napoleon wasn't there and then suddenly is, and he burns brightly and shines for a while and then fizzles out. And that is a perfect metaphor for the life of Napoleon. He does seem to just spark from out of nowhere, shine brightly for a while, and then fizzle out just as dramatically. So who was Napoleon and where did he come from? Well, Napoleon was born in 1769 on an island called Corsica out in the Mediterranean Sea. And despite the fact that Napoleon is one of the most popular figures in French history, a great French hero, he was in fact not French at all, and that is a little known fact. Napoleon was Corsican. That is to say, he was Italian. But just before his birth, the island of Corsica, which was inhabited by Italian people, was taken over by the French in war. So Napoleon and everyone who lived on Corsica were Italian, but they were part of France. So Napoleon's birth name was not Napoleon Bonaparte, it was Napoleon Buonaparte. And I don't know if you can hear the subtle difference in that, but Bonaparte is the French spelling and pronunciation of his name. Buonaparte is the Italian. Over the course of his life, life, Napoleon recognized, and I mean early life, in his early years, Napoleon and his parents realized and recognized that it would be more beneficial to their son to pronounce his last name and spell it in the French way, Bonaparte. So the Buonapartes who lived on Corsica were what we call old money. As long as anybody could remember, the Buonapartes had lived in a big fine house on the island of Corsica and had been rich and powerful. And so people assumed when Napoleon was born in 1769 that he too was rich. The fact is, his family was what we call petty nobility. They had a noble name, but they didn't have a big bank account to back that up. In truth, if people on Corsica had been able to see the bank account of the Buonapartes, they would not have been particularly impressed, at least not at Napoleon's birth. Generations of Buonapartes had squandered the family fortune, and the house, by the time of Napoleon's birth, was huge, true, but it was in a state of disrepair. All of the furnishings were a little bit shabby, the gardens were not well maintained, etc., etc. So this was something that weighed very heavily on the minds of Napoleon's parents. They had inherited enough money that they did not have to work. They did not have a big fortune, not like previous generations, but they were not going to have enough to leave to Napoleon so that he would be that blessed. So they thought long and hard about what they could do, because their poor son was going to have to be a working man, and this was devastating to them. What could they do, they wondered, to help their son? What path should he follow? How should they direct his path toward the future? Well, luckily, it all worked itself out pretty easily. Napoleon, as a little bitty boy, was fascinated with the French soldiers who were in occupation of Corsica. As soon as his mother turned him loose from the house every day, he would run down and find French soldiers hanging out on the streets in these various towns, and he would hang around with them and bring them snacks and that sort of stuff. And when he would come home swaggering around like a French soldier, speaking French, and his parents realized, he likes the military. Let's pack him off to military school. Maybe that is how our son will make a living, by being trained as an army sergeant or commander general. Possibly he could be a brigadier general or something. We'll send him to military school. That's the answer. So Napoleon was packed off to a military school in France, where his name was now pronounced Bonaparte and spelled Bonaparte instead of the Italian Buonaparte. Napoleon, even as a young boy, was recognized for his genius. It is interesting to note that Napoleon was absolutely brilliant, a man, a boy of great ability. His abilities, his strengths, his talents were evident from the earliest year that he was in military school. What was frustrating to his teachers was that Napoleon was absolutely brilliant. He had no match. He was a genius, recognized as such in his own lifetime, and he had a love of learning, but he just would not apply himself, and it drove his teachers nuts. He could have done so much better in school if he had actually done his work. He was learning the material. He mastered the material. He just wouldn't study for exams and apply himself very seriously to his studies. So what his teachers recognized about Napoleon is that he was brilliant, and he knew the material that he was taught in class, and he could apply it better than any other student, but he just wasn't going to make good grades. So what happened at military school is that Napoleon was given command of boys and older boys at school, and he could actually outmaneuver boys in military school who are much older than himself. What teachers learned about Napoleon is that he was learning the material and he could apply it better than anyone else, and he would beat anybody else at that school at war games. This was evident from an early age. Napoleon is still studied today at military establishments as a military genius. Napoleon In his early years here at military school, actually earned a nickname that would stick with him throughout his entire life. He was called Le Petit Corporal, or the Little General. Napoleon was a small guy, even by the standards of the time, barely over 5 feet tall, and some psychoanalysts have said that that was Napoleon's whole issue, that he was extremely aggressive and ambitious as a young man and throughout his entire life because of his small stature. In fact, they have named a syndrome after him called the Napoleonic Complex, or Little Man Syndrome. So Napoleon was very aggressive in personality and very good at war games. When he graduated from military school, Napoleon, this genius of a man, studied as a military genius today in military academies all around the world, including some of our own. He graduated 49th out of a class of 54. Probably not what you would expect. You would think someone who studied at the Citadel or West Point as a genius, one of the greatest military commanders of all time, would have graduated from military school like valedictorian of his class or something. But in fact, he did not. And I read a biography many years ago about Napoleon, and the author made a statement that I think is just really awesome. He said, Napoleon graduated 49th out of a class of 54, thus giving hope to students everywhere. So even if you graduate at the bottom of the class, it doesn't necessarily matter. It's what you can do that matters. Napoleon enlisted in the French army immediately. It was during the international phase of the French Revolution, and his ability to outmaneuver the enemy led him to move up and up and up in rank very quickly. By the age of 24, he had achieved the highest rank in the French army at the time, and that was Brigadier General. That is one heck of an accomplishment at the age of 24. That was a title or a position that many men in the French army worked their entire lives to gain and achieved just before their retirement. So Napoleon was a Brigadier General by the age of 24. And was a popular figure in the French newspapers because the stories that were told about Napoleon were always the same, that despite many obstacles or fewer troops than his enemy, he would outmaneuver them, capture them. People thought a lot of Napoleon and his ability. So when the Directory became very unpopular, people turned to Napoleon, this man who had come from humble beginnings and achieved so much at such a young age. It is important for me to just note here that Napoleon was, at this time in his career, a bit of a social climber as well. And what I mean by that is Napoleon knew that he did not have a family fortune. I mean, obviously, or he would not have been in military school, but he knew he did not have a family fortune. And what he aspired to was to be a very important man in French politics and in French society. He didn't know how he would get there, but he was going to achieve it. The first step for him, he thought, was to get a really good wife, and he had in mind this beautiful woman that he kept running into at parties. Her name was Josephine, and she was much older than Napoleon. She was in fact a widow of the Revolution. Her husband had been taken to the guillotine, and that was a source of pride for many women in France. It was something to brag about after the Revolution if their husbands had been taken to the guillotine. I know that sounds strange, but it was something that people admired. So she was very proud of her husband's death at the guillotine. She was a widow lady who was enjoying her newly found single status. She was a bit promiscuous for the time, which was relatively unheard of. That was not something that ladies in polite society did. So when Napoleon kept meeting Josephine at parties, he would have himself introduced to her, and she always seemed to have forgotten who he was. To be honest with you, he was younger, he was small, she was bigger than him actually. He was just a soldier, he was a brigadier general, but he was just a soldier, and she was having too much fun with her new single status to get involved in a serious relationship. But he was persistent, and he eventually won over Josephine. started dating her, this did not stop her from dating other men at the same time, and Napoleon was a bit blind to all that. Even after he convinced Josephine to marry him, he remained in denial about her adulterous ways until a friend confronted him and told him the truth, and then Napoleon broke down and cried. One of the things I will say about Napoleon is that his love of Josephine was absolute and true. They had a very rocky, troubled relationship, stormy relationship, but he was head over heels in love with her. One of the things that had led him to be attracted to her initially was that she was very wealthy, but apparently once he got to know her, he was totally committed to her. She not so much to him, even after being married. When he learned of Josephine's infidelity, I would imagine he probably really wasn't surprised. He had turned a blind eye to all of this because he was so crazy for her, but when he realized it was a bit of a joke among his friends and enemies, that people were talking about him and making fun of him behind his back, he confronted Josephine and threatened her with divorce. When she heard the word divorce, which was an embarrassment at the time, it was not commonplace, it was something that would be very devastating to a woman's reputation. She straightened up and she never cheated on Napoleon again. But it was a little too late, because at around about the same time, Josephine found herself going through, let's just say, a change of life. She was aging and was having no luck conceiving a child with Napoleon. Napoleon was desperate for a son, so he divorced Josephine and married a much younger woman named Mary Louise, who gave him his only child, a son that he also named Napoleon. But before you just write off Napoleon and say he was not truly in love with Josephine, if he was willing to trade her away just to get his son, let me tell you that when Napoleon died in 1821, it was recorded that his last word was Josephine. So even after all of that time and marrying another woman, he was still in love with his Josephine. So Napoleon, by 1799, was a popular military hero, a brigadier general, married to Josephine, a woman of great social status. In 1804, he made Josephine his empress for life, and they had a pretty good relationship, as I said, until he learned about her infidelity. Then he traded her in for a younger woman by whom he had a son. Napoleon has both a good and a bad side. Let me share with you first some of the good things that Napoleon did as emperor for life of France. He created a stable banking system for France for the first time in its history. He gave the middle class legal equality by law. He created the world's first engineering school, and he told anyone who was poor in France that if they had confiscated land during the French Revolution, they could keep it. He didn't care how they came to own that land, if they had murdered a noble or whatever. He was just going to turn a blind eye to that and allow them to keep any land. He also established a civil code that some people say is both good and bad. Here's what I mean by that. Napoleon tricked the French people. During the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte, there were no civil liberties for the people. Napoleon was more or less another absolutist military dictator, but he was very good at convincing the people that they had freedoms. They were allowed to vote in elections, for example. They did not realize that Napoleon had already predetermined who the winner would be. So Napoleon, in his codes, provided for civil liberties, but in actuality the people only had one civil liberty, and that was freedom of religion, because Napoleon himself was not a particularly spiritual man. He also said that women should be under the complete and total control of their husbands, that men should rule with an iron fist in their homes. And so I guess like we would say that, oh, that's terrible given our mindset today, that he's somehow chauvinist or whatever. We can't really fault him for that. He's a product of his time, and I think of his experiences. His desire that men should have complete control over their wives probably comes from his lack of control over his first wife, Josephine. Napoleon is most famous, though, for creating a huge army for France during his reign as emperor for life. Napoleon inherited an army that dated back to Louis XIV in terms of size. The standard army at the time was 250,000. Napoleon worked hard to get an army of 600,000 men. That was the biggest army ever assembled to that point in history. So you consider that the rest of Europe has armies that number 200,000 or less. Napoleon's army was huge, and he used this army to fight a series of wars in Europe named for him. His wars were called the Napoleonic Wars, and they lasted from 1799 to 1815. One thing that historians say that is good about Napoleon is that he preached a message of unity to the French people. And he told them all this 10 years of fighting against each other was a terrible mistake, French fighting French. We should not do that anymore. We should stop this revolution. We should all come together and fight our true enemies, who are Austria, Prussia, Spain, and Great Britain. So he brought the people together, preaching a message of unity. Let's turn against our true enemies, the rest of Europe, and he fought wars. These wars were called the Napoleonic Wars. What Napoleon achieved between 1799 and 1815 is quite impressive. Using his army of 600,000, Napoleon created what was called the Grand Empire. He gained control over all of continental Europe with the exception of Great Britain as a dependent satellite or ally, meaning that Napoleon controlled all of Europe either physically as a dependent or satellite by having one of his relatives on the throne of those areas. He would conquer territory in Europe and then place one of his cousins on the throne of that country. Or as an ally, he had an agreement of friendship between himself and that nation's leader. For example, Russia. The only country that remained as the lone sentinel watchdog, if you want to use that expression, against Napoleon was Great Britain. Great Britain was never invaded by Napoleon. They were able to resist him the entire time of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon conquered all of Europe as a dependent satellite or ally in his Napoleonic Wars. He was the most powerful man in Europe at that time. Wherever he went in conquest, Napoleon did one positive and one negative thing that I want to mention to you. On the positive side, he granted civil liberties and basic freedoms to all of his conquered subjects, but he also taxed them extremely harshly so that he could afford to pay his army of 600,000 and to continue conquest. If you think about it, it's really kind of ironic. His conquered subjects were paying exorbitant taxes to Napoleon so that he could keep them conquered. So they were paying to be conquered in essence. This was, of course, not popular, these high taxes, and revolts started throughout Europe against Napoleon's reign in 1808. But what was ultimately Napoleon's undoing was he invaded the country of Russia in 1812, and this was a move that has confused historians for generations. It is not understood still to this day why Napoleon chose to invade Russia, a country with whom his France was allied. All historians can figure is just that it's his complete and total unbridled ambition, just his desire for even more territory. But Napoleon makes some really big mistakes in his invasion in Russia in 1812, which leads to his demise. Napoleon figured that since most countries in Europe had fallen to him within the space of 2 to 4 weeks, that Russia would be pretty easy too. Russia was huge, though. It was much bigger than any other place he had attempted to invade, but they had a really tiny and honestly a really bad army. So he figured, okay, well, their army is bad, but it's a huge country, so let's allow 6 weeks for the takeover of Russia. So despite the fact that he had an alliance with Russia's Tsar, Napoleon gave orders for his men to invade Russia in the summer of 1812. He figured that this invasion would take just 6 weeks and Russia would be his. Unfortunately, he makes some real logistic errors here. He tells his men, we're going to leave now. We're going to abandon our commissary. We're not going to have a traveling soup kitchen or any of that. We're going to live off the land like men used to. We're going to take just what we have right now. It's almost like he just decided, let's go to Russia right now, and he didn't take steps to prepare adequately. So he and his men take off in summer uniforms with limited equipment, limited supplies, going to take over Russia in 6 weeks. Well, when you read about how the Russians respond to the French invasion, at first it seems cowardly, but it's absolutely brilliant. The Russians knew that they were no match for Napoleon's men. So whenever Napoleon and his men would draw near, the Russians would refuse to fight. They would retreat. But before they left the area in which they were camped, they would burn everything to the ground. Farms, livestock, crops. This is called a scorched earth policy. What the Russians are doing is they're sacrificing their land and crops so that they can draw Napoleon and his men farther and farther into the heart of Russia, farther and farther away from their supply lines, and at the same time avoid a battle with the French army, which is bigger, far superior, and weaken them by starving them out. So as Napoleon and his men draw near, the Russians retreat, and this goes on and on and on for weeks until an early snowstorm hits Russia. And Russia has very severe, unpredictable weather. Napoleon's men, by this point, are malnourished, sick, in terrible shape. They're far away from supply lines. They're really struggling. When this snowstorm hits, Napoleon abandons his men and rushes back to France to start trying to spin a story of how he won in Russia, but suffered huge losses. For many people, it is hard to believe that this great military commander, Napoleon, who had conquered all of Europe so quickly, would make such a terrible mistake, or that he wouldn't stay and rally his men and bring them back to France. But that is exactly what he did. So Napoleon rushed back to France and convinced the people of France that he had won, but had suffered major losses. Well, as the French soldiers start to retreat and come back home, when they get home, they tell a very different story. And what is plainly evident to everyone in France and the rest of Europe is that Napoleon must be lying, because he went into Russia with 600,000 men, and this is just mind-blowing. Only 30,000 of those men made it out. So as news spreads around Europe that Russia has taken a huge chunk out of Napoleon's army, he's only down to 30,000 seasoned, trained soldiers. The rest of Europe, who had been outnumbered by Napoleon, now pool all of their resources together and jump on him. They seize the opportunity to drive him out of power. Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne of France in 1814 by a combined force of various European armies. He was put in prison on the island of Elba out in the Mediterranean Sea, not far from the coast of France. When he was placed on the island of Elba, Napoleon suggested that his son by his second wife, this is his only child, Napoleon II, succeed him. His enemies refused. They chose instead the brother of the beheaded French king Louis XVI, who was Louis XVIII. So they placed on the throne of France, in Napoleon's absence, Louis XVIII. Napoleon was given a huge salary down on the island of Elba. He was even called Emperor of Elba. He was assigned a few jailers to watch him, but he had a great deal of freedom, even throwing parties and things while he was in exile and in jail. And on one occasion, the main jailer assigned to Napoleon went on vacation. back to Great Britain and did not pick someone to watch Napoleon. Napoleon had heard rumors and received letters that the French people were not satisfied with Louis XVIII, that they found him old and unimpressive, and they wanted Napoleon back. So, without a guard to keep him on the island of Elba, Napoleon seized a ship, sailed from Elba back into the coast of southern France, and quickly amassed an army of 100,000 men and marched right into Paris, where Louis XVIII gave up the throne and headed for Great Britain seeking safe haven. Napoleon marched right into Paris in February of 1815 unchallenged and assumed his reign as though his exile to Elba had never even happened. He was on the throne of France for 100 days, from February to June of 1815. Meanwhile, his enemies, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Great Britain, and now Russia, who had been invaded by Napoleon, his one-time ally of Russia, now gangs up with all the other countries in Europe, and they form what's called the Fourth Coalition or Quadruple Alliance. The main powers in that are Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain. They send a warning to Napoleon that he is to meet them in Belgium at Waterloo for a final battle in June of 1815. Well, Napoleon worked as quickly as he could, but he was only able to amass an army of about 250,000. Each of his enemies had 250,000, and even though Napoleon was a brilliant commander, he was no match for that kind of superior force. So, at the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815, Napoleon was defeated by the Quadruple Alliance. Again, he suggests as his replacement his son, Napoleon. His enemies refuse. They put on the throne of France yet again Louis XVIII. This time they've learned their lesson about Napoleon Bonaparte. They place him on a truly awful island off the coast of Africa that was very hot, humid, and mosquito-ridden. And Napoleon is not allowed any freedom whatsoever. His every move is watched. All he's allowed to do is have a quill and a scroll to write his memoirs or his biography, his autobiography. And while he's there writing his biography, Napoleon talks about how sick he feels, and he gradually becomes so weak that he can't even write anymore, and he describes all kinds of strange ailments, various physical pains, but mostly stomach problems. And for generations it was believed that Napoleon died in 1821 on the island of St. Helena from stomach cancer. The descriptions he provided of his illness seemed like to many people that it was ulcers or stomach cancer that had killed him, but recent evidence and research suggests that Napoleon was actually murdered by his jailers on the island of St. Helena so that he could not stage a comeback, and it's believed that he was poisoned with arsenic. And that ends our look at the French Revolution and Napoleonic era.